Now it's time for perspective on the programme. And one of the regular subjects we deal with here on France 24 is that of migrants, whether they be trying to get into the USA from Mexico, whether they may be trying to escape war, for example, in Syria, or whether they may just be moving from poorer European countries to richer ones to try to earn a better living. Of course, behind those headlines, though, lie thousands and thousands of personal stories of triumph, or of failure, or of a mixture of the two. And it's those stories that my guest today harnesses. Peter Gatrell is a Professor of Economic History at the University of Manchester. He's an historian of population displacement in the modern world, author of the book, The Unsettling of Europe. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. Of course, the issue of migrants, I mean, it's a major one nowadays. As I say, we're always talking about it here on France 24 for different reasons. But in the book, you look right back, don't you, to the end of the Second World War, where obviously migration was such a major issue at that time.
I do. I was struck when I started this book by the way in which politicians and the media and public at large spoke in 2015 as the Syrian civil war was really intensifying and people were trying to escape. I was struck by the way in which, for example, Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council, came out with this phrase, "Everything today is about immigration." And I thought to myself, I can see where he's coming from, but if we adopt a longer historical perspective, we can see that everything was about migration in 1945. It was about migration in 1989 and 1991 with the collapse of communism. So I wanted to adopt this broader perspective and also say to myself that immigration, the word immigration, only encapsulates part of the story because, as you hinted at a moment ago, if we drop the two first letters and talk about migration, we can think about much broader issues of people being on the move, including people who move to Europe and then return to their country of origin, or people who migrate within a country. And that might be moving from the south of Italy to the north, or from villages in France to the city, or indeed massive migrations in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Soviet Union, where the story is not about emigration. For obvious reasons, the Communist Party imposed controls on people leaving, but huge waves of people moving within the country itself. So, yes, people were, as it were, agitated about migration in 2015, but this has a much longer history.
And are the reasons the same as well? I mean, again, I mentioned in the top there, of course, some of it is economic, some of it is fleeing war, all sorts of different reasons why people move.
Yes, well, historically, that's always been the case. There have been people who move for what I call opportunity migration, and other people for whom migration is a matter of ordeal. It's a matter of escaping to save one's skin. But of course, if you probe a little more deeply, you can find that there are often mixed motives. You know, people who are thought to escape from persecution are often escaping from economic pressures, and people who are sometimes described as economic migrants may be facing all sorts of difficulties that make their lives not that different from people who are facing, imminent threats or even death at the barrel of a gun. But you're right, the history since 1945 is one of people moving for a variety of motives. In 1945, above all, we're talking about upheavals that are associated with the aftermath of war. And then you might think that the war brought peace and peace meant stability, but for millions of people, it meant further upheaval and disruption. If you were an ethnic German, for example, living in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary, the chances were that in 1945 you'd be told to pack your bags and head west for Germany, because those leaders both wanted to punish Germans for the horrors that had been inflicted during the Second World War, but also wanted to create a more ethnically homogenous Poland or Czechoslovakia.
And
So
presumably, Peter, as well,
country-
the way people think of the word migrant is similar and always has been similar as well. I mean, for example, individual people, you say the word migrant, and some people think positively, some people think very negatively, and also different countries, the way they respond. I mean, Germany, of course, recently opened its doors of late, but is now trying to put a bit of a break on that. Some would say the UK has shut its doors completely. Just last week, we heard from Emmanuel Macron of France saying France can't host everyone.
Well, these kinds of snippets of political rhetoric are really threaded throughout my book. You can find similar sorts of statements from British politicians in the late 1950s, obviously from French politicians in the 1980s. So there's nothing new about this rhetoric, but it does seem to me to carry unfortunate implications that migrants are a source of anxiety or a threat, insofar as politicians talk about migrants as a burden.
Yeah, you do acknowledge that it can be a threat, don't you, in the book?
Well, I acknowledge that people who might be thought to be similar, for example, in ethnicity, are often portrayed as a threat. It doesn't have to be people of different skin color or different religious faith. But for example, if you were Greek living in the Soviet Union, as thousands and thousands did, and wanted after the collapse of communism to leave and to try and make a life for yourself in Greece, you faced really a hostile welcome. You were regarded, to all intents and purposes, as a threat. And many of these millions of Germans who moved to West and East Germany in the late 1940s were similarly regarded with complete contempt, even though they spoke or often spoke the same language. So the idea of this kind of hostility or hostile environment is not new, nor is it confined, for example, to people who are trying to make their way, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa or from the Caribbean to Europe throughout the decades since 1945.
Peter, we're almost out of time, but let me just ask you quickly. I mean, how do you respond to those who dismiss or perhaps even demonise migrants? Quick answer, if you can.
In short, migrants are human beings. They come in all shapes and sizes. The population of migrants is going to contain people who are skilled and brilliant, people who want to work hard. It's going to contain a fair number of people who might be regarded as unpleasant, but the general population also contains people who are, as it were, not necessarily the most desirable people who don't have much to contribute. Migrants often have made extraordinary journeys and want to make the best of their lives in new sites, and not necessarily to stay forever, but to go back and help rebuild their own societies.
Peter Gatrell, thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. Peter Gatrell, Professor of Economic History at the University of Manchester. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. Remainder of the main headlines then. Protests kicking off in Hong Kong. We've been getting reports of some tear gas being used and barricades being put up there, with hundreds of masked protesters converging in the city centre. Those protests coming as huge celebrations in Beijing mark 70 years today of Communist Party rule, with a massive parade, thousands taking part in real display of military might there.